And now, to go into the program without any reading of a bio, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ted Egan, the Chief Economist from the City and County of San Francisco. Ted?
And thank you, everyone, and good morning. It's a great honor to be the first speaker to kick off your Spring Summit. This morning, I'm just going to speak for a few minutes. I hope I leave time for 2 or 3 questions about the topic of where our economy is and where it's come from recently. My job as the chief economist of the city is mainly to look at new legislation that gets introduced in San Francisco, so I get to look at a lot of interesting policy issues that the city grapples with. But I also spend time kind of tracking the city's economy, the local economy, and offer my thoughts to the people who forecast our revenues at the city. And so I think I'll share you just sort of our understanding, and this is a San Francisco kind of focused perspective, but it generally applies to the entire Bay region about the time we're living in now. And it's really been an extraordinary time. From the perspective of San Francisco, as far back as the economic statistics go, which is really back to the 1960s, if you look at economic statistics for a county, San Francisco has been a shrinking piece of the Bay Area economy. From the 60s up until about the middle of the 2000s, around 2005, every year San Francisco was a smaller share of employment in the Bay Area than it was the previous year. And we know the reasons for that. We've had tremendous growth in the rest of the region for all that time period. We had the growth of Silicon Valley. We had all the growth of the suburban areas in Alameda and Contra Costa County, as well as major employment centers within the North Bay in Marin County and in Santa Rosa. And San Francisco was a full city. You know, it hadn't added a lot of new space. All of its land had been developed by the 1950s. There wasn't a lot of room to grow. And so it wasn't that surprising that San Francisco was a smaller share of a very growing, dynamic growing region. But something really started to change around the middle of the last decade. Every year since 2005, San Francisco has been a bigger and bigger share of the total employment in the region. And this has really accelerated this decade since 2010. This decade has been the single fastest growth period in San Francisco since the gold rush, to put things in a little bit of perspective. The previous sort of crazy period, the high water mark, the zany period of growth we thought would never happen again was the dot-com boom. And that was a pretty fast period of growth in the late 90s. We added 17,000 jobs a year from 1996 to 2000. From 2010 to 2015, San Francisco added 25,000 jobs a year for 5 years. The 2016 data isn't out yet. It'll be out in a couple months. I think it will show maybe not 25,000 jobs, but probably around 20,000 jobs. So we have seen in this period the fastest growth San Francisco has seen, certainly in the 20th century and probably, or since the turn of the 20th century, and probably way back into the very first days of the city and the region. It's not just unusual by San Francisco standards, though. San Francisco has also been the fastest growing city of any major city, of any large urban county, in fact, in the United States this decade. It goes back and forth from one year to the next with Austin. Austin is a very fast-growing place. Difference between Austin and San Francisco is, and this isn't Austin, it's actually Travis County, Texas. They have a lot of green fields, and in green fields you can throw up an office park, an industrial park pretty quickly and add jobs that way. We can't do that in San Francisco. The 25,000 jobs a year that we've added since 2010, they're basically all going into buildings that were built before 2010. We're basically just compressing more and more people, more and more economic activity into more or less the same physical space. And nevertheless, we are growing certainly faster than the other land-constrained central city, and we're among the fastest growing counties of any part of the United States. So really, the past 10 years have been just a dramatic reversal of where San Francisco's economic role in the region is and how it performs relative to sort of peer cities across the country. So what's going on to cause this change? And if you could simplify things, and it's really not too much of a simplification to say one thing is causing it, it's been the growth of the tech sector in San Francisco. The data on detailed industry statistics for counties goes back to 1990. And that period, information technology, which was very big in Santa Clara County then, pretty big in San Mateo County then, was 1% of the jobs in San Francisco County, maybe 2% of the jobs. It grew during the 1990s. Again, during the dot-com boom, we had a peak. It was maybe 4% of jobs in San Francisco during that period. It's now over 10% of all the private sector jobs in San Francisco. And it's over 20% of all the private sector payroll in San Francisco, which is to say more than 1 out of every $5 that is earned by private sector workers in the city is earned by people in the tech sector. If you walk around San Francisco and you tell them this, you're like, it's only 1 in 5? Yes, it's only 1 in 5. It's not 4 in 5. It's 1 in 5. But in 2010, it was 8%, 7–8%. So it's really basically tripled as a share of the city's growing private sector payroll in a 5-year period. The era of technology companies that are growing now tend to favor urban locations like San Francisco. You can see these clusters of information technology, social media companies growing in New York City and London, downtown LA to some extent, in central cities around the world. But no central city gets as much as San Francisco because it's part of the Bay Area, which has been the pioneer of so much technology for so long. It's very fair to say that technology has driven San Francisco's growth this decade. In a lot of ways, when you look at the timing of the region's recovery from the recession, you see the initial growth starting in 2011 period in San Francisco and Santa Clara County, and the tech sector pulls those areas out. And then you see San Mateo County, and then by 2013 you start to see the East Bay, 2014 you start to see the North Bay. At this point, San Francisco's economy, or its housing market, has actually kind of plateaued. But Solano County has the fastest, hottest real estate market in the United States. So that kind of ripple effect is still happening. But things have started to change in San Francisco, and they haven't changed anything like the way they changed in 2001. We're not seeing anything like a tech implosion. But we are seeing signs of slowing growth in our tech sector just in the past year, year and a half. If you look at the annual growth rate of technology jobs in San Francisco, San Mateo County, and in that 2-county region, we have data that's almost real time, that really comes with a 3-week lag every month. We've seen a dramatic slowdown in tech employment. A year and a half ago, it was growing 15% a year. Now it's growing 2–3% a year. It's actually growing more slowly than the rest of the job base. So the sector that was driving all of this job growth, that was growing 2 or 3 times as fast as the rest of the economy, is now growing more slowly than the rest of the economy. And there are other reasons, too, why we need to expect job growth in San Francisco, and I think to varying degrees this is going to be true throughout the rest of the region. We need to expect slower growth for the rest of this decade. The unemployment rate in San Francisco on a seasonally adjusted basis is about 3%. Most economists will tell you full employment is about 4.5%. So we've been cruising well under full employment for about a year and a half. That means if you're trying to hire someone in San Francisco, it's not easy to get them. And while we are building what feels like to many in San Francisco a lot of housing, it's not enough housing to support enough new members of the labor force to sustain the rate of job growth that we have seen earlier this decade. So in some extent, it's a numbers game around available people to hire. Now, of course, we can, if you're an employer based in San Francisco, you can hire people anywhere throughout the region, and more than half of the private sector workers in San Francisco don't live in the city. That raises the second constraint, however, that we're dealing with, which is transportation. I've tried to estimate the total time cost of commuting to a job in San Francisco this decade. In 2011, according to my calculations, which are rough, but I don't think they're crazy, if you value people's time at half their wage, people spent the equivalent of about $3 billion worth of time getting to jobs in San Francisco in 2011. Now they spend about $5 billion worth of time, a 60% increase in the time cost of commuting in a 4 or 5 year period. That is a consequence of more people, 125,000 new jobs, higher wages, particularly driven by the tech sector, which is the highest wages of any industry, but also a rather precipitous increase in the average commuting time to jobs in the city, and I think that that's also true as a region. So the transportation system of the region, which, like the housing stock, has not expanded in anything like the pace of increase in demand for transportation, is becoming a block on growth. A third block on growth in the city, which I think is a distant third, is commercial office space. We are now reaching a point of tightness in the commercial office space, but fortunately, we are actually building a lot of office space in the city, the Salesforce Tower and other projects. So I don't think that's going to be the thing that slows our growth. But I am worried about the lack of people available to work, the expense, the housing cost of getting new people to move here, and of course the difficulty in building housing, particularly in the short term, to keep up with demand. And as I just said, I'm also worried about transportation. So part of the story of why our expectations for the cities and the region economy is going to slow is simply that we've reached our infrastructure limits, and those don't change quickly. Whether we want to change them or we don't want to change them, if we make that decision today, we're not going to get anything set up this cycle. So we're going to have to live with whatever slowing is caused by infrastructure constraints, at least in this cycle. However, there's also signs in the tech sector itself that it may be kind of reaching the end of one of its natural cycles. I think the evidence here is a little bit mixed. It's actually getting more mixed than it was 3 or 6 months ago. But one of the huge fuels for the tech sector employment in San Francisco is venture capital investment. I would estimate maybe 2/3 of the jobs in the tech sector in San Francisco are at companies that are not currently making money. They're getting revenues, but they're not profitable companies. Those companies either need to make changes to become profitable or they need new investment. And if the investment starts to dry up, that's going to affect their ability to hire at the rates that they've been hiring people. Venture capital is way off its peak in the middle of 2015. It declined for 6 quarters in a row, and then the last quarter, it ticked up again slightly. So venture capital is a lower point. It's very hard to predict. It's actually very closely tied to the stock market. And in fact, we started to see a drop in venture capital investment in the Bay Area region in 2015, right about the time that the NASDAQ had a pretty big 10 or 15% correction. NASDAQ in the past 6 months has been on a bit of a tear. The NASDAQ, if you even take out the kind of weekly ebbs and flows, it's trending upward, and that may be the thing that's putting a little bit of life back in venture capital. So I think we've moved into a situation now where the real near term, and by near term I mean 2-3 year outlook for the Bay Area, has to do with how much confidence investors have in tech stocks. How does that translate into venture capital investment? And how does that translate into more hiring of tech companies in the region? A number of people think that the incredibly high cost of living in the Bay Area is driving out tech companies. I'm not convinced of that explanation. It may be driving out other companies that can't afford to pay those prices, although in San Francisco we're still seeing employment growth in every industry. I think it's more likely that we are the center of innovation in the US tech industry. We're the place where half the venture capital in the country gets invested. And if investors are not in quite the same mood to invest in experimentation now as they might have been 4 or 5 years ago, that's going to have consequences. If they get back in the mood to invest in experimentation, well, we've always been one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive region in the country. And it hasn't stopped us from having really an unprecedented period of economic growth this decade. So I think I'll stop there. I think we may have time for a couple of questions, and I guess there's a roving microphone, so feel free to ask away if you've got any questions. Or if not.
Ask your question?
Sure.
Whatever. I'm used to be a lifeguard. I don't know.
Oh, now it's on.
My question is, if the political uncertainty that exists in D.C. transfers to the theme of our program, the regulatory uncertainty and business uncertainty, how threatened is our economy by the gridlock in D.C., Sacramento doing its thing, the regulators trying to balance it, and the business community trying to make everything work? Are we going to see potentially an implosion or a downtrend in the economic growth?
The regulatory, let's say the political dynamics at 3 levels of government operating at the same time makes that a little bit of a challenging question to grapple with. I could argue that if we were to take the president at his word at the time that he won about what his economic priorities are, gridlock might not be the worst thing for the Bay Area. The major priorities of the Trump administration seem to be curtailing trade or getting trade fairer. Well, there's no region that benefits more from trade than the Bay Area and in California too when you consider trade and agriculture. So if there's a desire to sort of punish China, stop free trade with South Korea, punish Japan, he's already abandoned the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have been very good for agriculture and technology industry. I think if we could stop that, that would probably be good. His concerns about immigration, limiting visas, and I'm not saying that the H-1Bs don't need any reform at all, or all reform is bad. But the idea that you want to limit that directly hurts us. Undocumented immigrants are a major part of the economy of this region. Every business will feel it if there are draconian measures to limit that labor supply, which our growing economy needs. From a strictly economic point of view, the real positive from the Trump administration is the promise of a corporate tax break, which is really just bringing forward money at a time of basically full employment. So it's not going to have a tremendous stimulative effect, but, and we'll have to pay for it someday, but that is probably contributing to the feel-good atmosphere in the stock market. And that may give us, as Ken Rosen, it's such a great line, I'll copy his line, it gives us a little sugar high for 1.5 years and continues our economic cycle for that period. And I guess that's time, so thank you very much.